A 17-year-old boy walked into court alone, determined to prove his innocence, armed with nothing but a stack of notes and the memory of a father who died fighting the same system. But when the judge mocked him and the courtroom laughed, could he still turn the tide in his favor? If you believe the truth deserves a voice, no matter who speaks it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Now let's go back to the moment it all began. In a quiet southern town where time seemed to move slower and justice even slower, one courtroom buzzed with a tension that you could almost feel in your chest. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of curious eyes, most of them white, most of them convinced they already knew how this story would end. At the center of it all stood a boy, 17-year-old Malik Carter, slim, dark-skinned, dressed in a second-hand suit 2 sizes too big, borrowed from a cousin who had worn it once to a funeral. Malik didn't have a lawyer. He didn't have money. He didn't have anyone in that courtroom who believed in him. But he had something no one else could see. Conviction. His hands trembled slightly as he set down a worn-out folder of handwritten notes. He looked so out of place, so young, so alone. And yet there was a quiet fire behind his eyes, like he'd already been judged long before today and was used to standing alone. Across the courtroom, the prosecutor, Richard Bowman, sharp suit, sharper tongue, leaned back in his chair with a smug grin. To him, this wasn't a trial. It was a formality. And then came the voice that cut through the silence like a blade. Judge Evelyn Hardwick, late 50s, stern face carved by decades of authority. She adjusted her glasses, narrowed her eyes at Malik, and spoke with the cold finality of someone who'd already made up her mind. Mr. Hap Carter, you've chosen to represent yourself in this matter? Grand theft auto and resisting arrest are serious charges. This is not a debate club. Do you truly think you're qualified to stand before this court? There was a faint chuckle from the gallery, a scoff from the prosecutor's table. Malik didn't flinch. He slowly rose to his feet, cleared his throat, and replied, "No, Your Honor. I'm not qualified, but I am innocent. And today, that's what I came to prove." The room fell still. The judge raised an eyebrow. The smirks faded, but only for a moment, because what no one in that courtroom realized yet was that this boy they were all so eager to dismiss was about to make them question everything they thought they knew. The first to take the stand was Officer Edward Collins. Middle-aged, buzz-cut, shoulders squared like he never forgot his army days. His voice was firm, confident, like he'd done this 100 times before and never once been challenged. "I saw the defendant," he said, leaning into the driver's side window holding what looked like a tool. He was fumbling with the wires, attempting to hotwire the vehicle. When I identified myself as law enforcement, he ran. A few heads nodded in the gallery. It sounded convincing, clean, neat. But Malik was already scribbling notes. When it was his turn, he stood slowly, walked to the front, and faced Officer Collins, not with hostility, but with a calm, deliberate steadiness that caught even the judge off guard. "Officer Collins," Malik began, "you said you saw me fumbling with wires. Can you tell the court how far away you were when you observed this?" Collins didn't hesitate. "Roughly 20 feet. At night?" "Yes, it was dark." Malik nodded. "And the window, was it rolled down?" "No, closed." "So from 20 feet away in the dark through a closed car window, you could see me, a black teenager in a dark hoodie, fumbling with internal wiring?" A murmur swept through the courtroom. The judge lifted her eyes from her notepad, watching more closely now. Malik didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Your Honor," he said, "with permission, I'd like to approach the witness." The judge gave a small nod. Malik walked to Officer Collins and placed a laminated photo in front of him. "This is a photo of the exact car in question. Can you show the court where the ignition wires are located?" Collins frowned, studied the photo, then pointed hesitantly to the dashboard area, deep inside behind the steering column. Malik turned to face the jury. His voice was steady, but there was weight behind every word. "The ignition wires are here, hidden deep inside the dash, not visible from outside the car. And yet Officer Collins claims he saw me fumbling with them, in the dark, from 20 feet away, through a closed window." Another wave of whispers. A few jurors leaned forward now. The prosecutor stood, flustered. "Objection. This is speculation." But before the judge could respond, Malik turned back calmly. Your Honor, if the state's key witness is basing his accusation on something physically impossible, how can his entire testimony be trusted? There was silence. And then the judge spoke. Overruled. Continue, Mr. Carter. And just like that, the mood in the courtroom shifted. For the first time, someone wasn't just hearing Malik. They were listening. The next witness was Patricia Monroe, the registered owner of the black sedan that Malik was accused of stealing. She walked to the stand with the firm, practiced grace of someone used to being heard and rarely questioned. Her hair was perfectly pinned, her blazer crisp, but her jaw tight and her eyes cold. She didn't glance once in Malik's direction. She told the court that she had parked her car in front of her house the night before. When she woke the next morning, it was gone. She didn't know who could have taken it, but hours later, police found it with a young black teenager inside. To her, the story was complete. But when Malik stood, the room quieted. He didn't challenge her directly. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he asked her gently, had she seen the car being taken? She hadn't. She was asleep. Were the windows broken? No. All intact. Any sign of forced entry? None. Malik paused and looked at her. Then he asked, as if it were an afterthought, who else has access to your car keys? There was a flicker, barely noticeable, but her eyes shifted for the first time. Just me, she replied, and my husband. That was all he needed. Malik turned to the judge, politely and clearly, and requested to call a new witness, Mr. Charles Monroe. The prosecutor jumped up, objecting. This witness hadn't been on any list. This was unexpected, improper, a disruption. But Malik's response was calm, as always. Your Honor, the truth doesn't always arrive on schedule. If the prosecution missed it, that doesn't mean it doesn't belong here. Judge Evelyn watched him closely, then slowly nodded. And just like that, Charles Monroe was called to the stand. Tall, reserved, and visibly uncomfortable, he moved with hesitation. His steps were heavy. His gaze remained low. As he was sworn in, Malik stood still, giving the man space, then asked simply if he had access to the car keys. Charles nodded. Yes, he did. Then came the question that shifted everything. Did you lend the car to anyone the night it went missing? Charles hesitated, his hands clenched in his lap, and across the courtroom his wife sat perfectly still, like a statue made of pressure. He didn't look at her when he answered. I lent it to my nephew Alex. He needed it for a date. The words hit the room like a crack of thunder, audible gasps, murmurs. Someone whispered, "You're kidding." Patricia Monroe didn't move, but the flush rising in her cheeks said everything. Malik stayed rooted in place. His voice remained steady. So to clarify, on the night in question, the car wasn't stolen. It was loaned. By you, and no one told the police this? Charles looked down. No, I didn't think it was important. Didn't think it was important. Malik turned toward the jury. His tone never shifted, but his words carried more weight now. The entire foundation of the prosecution's case rests on the idea that I stole a car. But the car was never stolen. There was no break-in. No damage, no criminal intent, just a detail, left out, ignored, or hidden. The prosecutor stood again, clearly agitated. Your Honor, the defendant was still found in the vehicle without permission. But Malik turned to face the bench before the judge could reply. Your Honor, if the car wasn't stolen, then this is not Grand Theft Auto. And if this isn't Grand Theft Auto, then what exactly is it? There was silence. Even Judge Evelyn didn't respond right away. She looked at Charles Monroe, then at her own notes, then finally back at Malik. Something was unraveling, and she knew it. Malik gave a respectful nod and returned to his seat. As Mr. Monroe stepped down from the stand, the tension in the courtroom had shifted again. Not just in the air, but in the eyes of the people watching. The smirks were gone. So were the whispers of certainty. Now there was doubt, and maybe, just maybe, something else. Respect. The courtroom had grown still after Charles Monroe's confession. What began as a confident prosecution was starting to look careless, or worse, conveniently selective. But Malik wasn't done. He stood once more and called his next witness, Alex Monroe, the nephew who had borrowed the car that night. Alex was thin, awkward, barely 18. He shuffled to the stand with the kind of nervous energy that made you wonder if he'd ever spoken in public before. His eyes darted around the room, never quite settling. Especially not on his aunt. As he sat, Malik walked slowly across the courtroom, not asking questions right away, just letting the silence press down. Then, Gently, he asked Alex to explain what happened that night. And the boy spoke. He admitted his uncle had lent him the car, said he used it for a quick date. Nothing out of the ordinary. But afterward, he'd parked it a few blocks from home and walked inside, figuring he'd bring it back the next morning. When he returned, the car was gone. He didn't tell anyone, didn't call the police. He hadn't even mentioned it to his uncle. Why? Because he was scared. Scared of being blamed. Scared of what people might assume. Scared in the simplest way of getting in trouble. The room was quiet. And then Malik turned back to the judge and asked the question that had been hanging in the air since the trial began. If the car wasn't stolen, why was I arrested? There was no answer. At least, not yet. But Malik had come prepared. He asked for a piece of video evidence to be shown, not the one from the security camera provided by police, but a different clip. One recorded by his best friend, Zion, from across the street that very night. The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered on, grainy, unsteady, but clear enough. It showed Malik approaching the car slowly, cautiously. The door appeared slightly open. He leaned in, looked around, no sudden movements, no attempt to flee. And then, just as suddenly, a man in plain clothes rushed toward him from the shadows. No badge, no warning, just a voice yelling something unintelligible in the blur of movement. Malik turned and ran. Gasps echoed in the courtroom. The camera shook, followed the scene for only a moment more, then cut off. Malik stepped forward, facing the jury. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply said what was now plain to see. He hadn't resisted arrest. He had feared for his life. The man who came at him gave no sign that he was a police officer. No uniform. No badge. Just aggression. From the dark, the silence in the courtroom grew heavier. At the very back of the gallery, a woman sat frozen in place. She had been there the entire time, quiet and unseen. It was Malik's mother. She hadn't wanted him to go through with this. She had begged him not to. She had seen what happened to men who dared challenge the system. She had buried one, her husband, Malik's father. But now, as she watched her son stand tall, not with anger, but with truth, she couldn't hold it in anymore. A tear slid down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Malik didn't see her cry, but maybe he felt it. Because when he returned to his seat, the courtroom no longer saw a boy defending himself. They saw a system cracking, and a young man calmly, patiently, pushing at its seams. The courtroom was still. Not the kind of stillness that comes from routine, but the kind that follows a shift, subtle but irreversible. Something had changed. The accusations had cracked, the evidence had thinned, and now all that remained was the question no one dared to ask aloud. Who was Malik Carter really? Not on paper, not in police reports, but underneath it all. Malik stood once more, not with urgency, not with defiance. He moved as though he were carrying something fragile, and he was. From the inside of his weathered folder, he drew a small, creased envelope, folded so many times the edges had worn soft like cloth. A letter, faded, fragile, written by a man who no longer walked this earth. Malik didn't raise it up for drama. He didn't show it to the room. He simply held it, gently, with both hands. Then he looked toward the bench. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady but low. "This letter was written by my father, from prison, before he died. He wanted me to read it when I was old enough to understand." Judge Evelyn didn't say a word. She simply gave a faint nod. Malik unfolded the letter slowly, like unfolding memory itself. He didn't read it all, just enough. His voice didn't tremble, but the pause between sentences told a deeper story. "My son, if one day you understand the law, not just the words, but the weight, I hope you use it to lift someone else, not to get ahead, but to pull someone back from being forgotten. Even if that someone is you." He stopped there. But the silence that followed said more than any line could. Malik didn't return to his seat. He looked out toward the jury, the judge, the rows of silent faces, and then gently his voice filled the room again. Not reciting, not debating, just speaking. The kind of speaking that came from a place deeper than courage. "I didn't stand up here because I thought I could win. I stood up because I couldn't keep watching people like my father disappear. My mother told me not to do this. She said, 'Don't fight them. They won't let you win.' And honestly, I believed her." He paused. Then he looked toward the back of the room, where his mother sat, hands folded, shoulders straight, her eyes unreadable, but her presence unshakable. Malik turned back to the room. But I didn't come here to win. I came here to be seen, not just as a defendant, but as a son, as a boy who didn't steal a car, but inherited a burden. A few jurors shifted in their seats. One of them, an older woman with silver hair, lowered her gaze and exhaled, and in that quiet space, Malik's mother closed her eyes. She had watched her husband walk into a courtroom and never return. She had raised a child in a world that warned him to stay silent. She had begged him not to do this. And now, watching him stand, not to lash out, but to lift something greater than himself, she felt the sting of tears. But she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall. Not for pain, but for pride. Judge Evelyn hadn't written a word in several minutes. Her pen lay still, her gaze locked on the boy standing before her. Not with the dispassion of a judge, but the recognition of a human being who had just witnessed something real. And maybe for the first time in a very long time, she didn't see a docket number. She saw a child, standing where no child should ever have to stand. Malik said nothing more. He folded the letter back, slowly, carefully, and placed it inside the folder. Then he returned to his seat. No applause, no gasp, just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for permission. The kind that settles into the corners of a room and stays there. Because what had just happened wasn't an argument. It was the truth. And finally, everyone in that room had heard it. After all the witnesses, all the facts, and all the unraveling, there was one story left to tell. His. The judge asked the question plainly, formality more than invitation. "Mr. Carter, do you wish to testify on your own behalf?" Malik nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." He stood, not quickly, not with flair, but with the kind of calm that only comes after carrying the weight of silence for too long. As he walked toward the witness stand, a kind of hush settled across the room. Not fear, not drama, but something quieter. A tension rooted in curiosity, in conscience, in that uneasy space where perception begins to shift. He was sworn in, sat, adjusted the microphone with care, then rested his palms on the surface before him, grounding himself. He didn't begin with emotion, he began with the truth. He told them how he'd been walking home that night, just past 10, after a long shift at the gas station where he worked weekends. He didn't drive, never had, couldn't afford a car, so walking home through dim streets was nothing new. What was new was the black sedan, parked just a little crooked, driver's door slightly ajar, no lights on, no sign of anyone nearby. It didn't feel right. Something about it looked out of place, like someone had left in a hurry, like something had gone wrong. He slowed his steps, walked closer. He didn't touch it. Not at first. He leaned in, looked inside. An old backpack in the back seat, a soda can in the cup holder, glove box cracked open. No broken windows, no alarm. Malik paused in his story here, not for effect, but because the memory was sharp, clear, and he wanted every word to land exactly where it belonged. He said he didn't know why he leaned in further. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe concern, maybe it was instinct, some small voice saying check before you move on. What he didn't expect was the voice behind him, shouting, aggressive, no warning, no context. Just a sudden surge of sound, and then a man charging straight toward him. Not a uniform, not a badge, jeans, hoodie, civilian clothes, and anger. That's all he saw. Malik's voice didn't rise as he spoke, but the room felt tighter with every sentence. He described what that moment felt like. Not just confusion, but fear. Not the kind of fear that makes your heart skip, but the kind that comes from centuries of stories that ended badly for boys who didn't run. He didn't know who the man was. He didn't ask. He ran, not away from justice, but toward safety. Because in that split second, what mattered wasn't who was right, it was who might survive. He didn't cry as he spoke, didn't beg for sympathy. He simply offered his memory, piece by piece, shaped by the world he'd grown up in. He talked about his neighborhood, how folks learned early on not to wait for explanations. That hesitation could be the difference between walking home and not going home at all. He said, I didn't run from the law, I ran from danger, because I didn't see an officer. I saw a man charging at me, angry, fast, shouting. No badge, no time. He let that sit, then he added softly, and if I'd stayed, who knows if I'd be standing here right now. Across the courtroom, the faces that once looked skeptical now held something different. Not pity, not guilt, but attention. Real attention. As though for the first time, they were no longer evaluating a case file, they were listening to a life. Malik went on to explain how, after being tackled and cuffed, he still didn't know what was happening. No one explained why he'd been arrested. No one told him the car had been reported stolen. No one asked him what he was doing there. He was just taken, processed, labeled, charged. And then he did something that caught everyone off guard. He looked down, then up again, straight at the jury. His voice didn't shake, but it carried the tremble of history. I know what people see when they look at me. A young black male, no lawyer, no money, must have done something. He wasn't angry, just tired. I grew up hearing my mom say, "Keep your head down. Don't give them a reason." But that night, I didn't even have a reason. I was just there. He exhaled, slow and heavy. So I ran. Because when a man comes at you like that, and you don't know who he is, and the world you live in tells you that people who look like you don't get second chances, you run. At the back of the courtroom, Malik's mother sat perfectly still, her eyes locked on her son, not pleading, not afraid, but proud. A quiet kind of pride, shaped by loss, sharpened by experience. She had warned him not to fight, not to challenge the system, because she had seen what it did to her husband. But now, watching Malik speak with honesty, clarity, and restraint, she understood something else. Her son wasn't fighting to win. He was fighting to be heard. Malik finished with this. I didn't come here expecting to change anyone's mind. I came here to speak my truth, because my father never got that chance, because too many like him never do. And if I sit down without saying this, then I become part of the silence that took him. He didn't wait for a reaction. He didn't ask for one. He simply looked at the judge, nodded respectfully, and returned to his seat. The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was reverent. In that moment, the room wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a space where a boy had turned into a voice, and that voice had reminded everyone what justice was supposed to sound like. Malik had said everything he came to say, not with fire, not with fury, but with something much harder to dismiss: truth. He returned to his seat, and for a few long seconds, no one moved. No one even blinked. Because what he left hanging in the air wasn't just a defense, it was a reminder of how easily people like him were misunderstood, misjudged, forgotten. And then, just before the judge could speak, Malik turned once more toward the jury. His voice was quieter now, but every word landed with weight. I don't have a law degree. I don't have a fancy suit. I don't even have a lawyer. He paused, then added, steady as ever. But I have the truth and a letter from a father who died waiting for justice to matter. That was it, the last thing he would say in his own defense. And somehow, it said everything. The silence that followed wasn't like the silences before. It wasn't confused or uncomfortable. It was full. Full of the things people weren't sure how to say. One juror wiped her glasses slowly but didn't put them back on. Another rested both hands flat on the railing in front of him, his eyes no longer darting, just fixed. Even the prosecutor sat frozen, his pen idle. He had prepared 100 rebuttals, but none of them made sense anymore. In the back row, Malik's mother leaned forward just slightly. Not to cry, not to break, but to breathe. For the first time in hours, maybe days, she allowed herself that quiet, steady breath. The kind of breath that says, he made it this far. And maybe that's already a victory. At the bench, Judge Evelyn Hardwick sat straighter than usual. Her fingers no longer moved across the page. Her gaze no longer darted between faces. She looked at Malik the way someone might look at a mirror that had just been cleaned, seeing not just the reflection, but the blind spots behind it. Years on the bench had taught her how to spot manipulation, exaggeration, spin. But what she'd just seen was real. And when she finally spoke, her voice had lost the cold sharpness it carried at the start of the trial. It was quieter now, more human. Mr. Carter, Malik looked up. You've done something rare here today. You didn't just defend yourself. You made us look closer, think harder. There was a pause, not for effect, but because even she was choosing her words carefully. Carter, you should go to law school, not to win cases, not to prove people wrong. She looked at him, this time not as a judge, but as a woman who had finally listened. But to change things. Malik didn't speak, didn't smile. He just nodded once, because he knew. Not everything would change today, maybe not even tomorrow. But something had shifted. And for the first time in his life, the system didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a door. The jury took only 3 hours to deliberate. But for Malik, it felt like a lifetime. He sat quietly at the defense table, hands folded, eyes lowered, not in defeat, but in stillness. Around him, the courtroom murmured softly, reporters whispered, observers leaned forward, and then the door opened. 12 people filed in, calm, composed, carrying something more than just a verdict. They carried the weight of everything they had just witnessed. The judge called the room to order, asked the foreman to stand. A middle-aged man in a navy jacket rose, paper in hand. His voice was steady. On the charge of grand theft auto, we find the defendant not guilty. A collective breath escaped the room. Some gasped. Others lowered their heads in quiet relief. On the charge of resisting arrest, we find the defendant not guilty. And then, silence. But not like before. This silence held emotion, held memory, held justice. Malik didn't react right away. He sat still, processing, not the words, but what they meant. And then from behind him, a pair of arms wrapped around his shoulders. His mother, her grip was tight, shaking, but warm. She didn't say much, just leaned in close, her voice no louder than a whisper. Your father would be proud of you, so proud. Malik closed his eyes. For a brief moment, he let go. Of the tension, of the fight, of the weight he'd been carrying since the day this began. As the courtroom began to empty, a familiar figure approached. Alex Monroe, hands in his pockets, shoulders slumped with something that wasn't guilt, but shame. He stood in front of Malik, eyes low. I'm sorry, he said softly. I should have told the truth sooner. I didn't mean for any of this. Malik looked at him, not with anger, not with bitterness, just a quiet kind of understanding. It's okay, he said. We all learn at our own pace. Alex nodded, then stepped back into the crowd. One more young man carrying a lesson he'd never forget. Outside the courthouse, the sun had begun to dip, but the sky was golden, a soft, warm glow stretching across the city like hope reaching for the horizon. On the steps, Malik's best friend stood waiting. Camera phone in hand, he didn't say a word, just hit record. And through that small lens, he captured a boy walking out of a courtroom. Not defeated, transformed. Malik stepped into the light, blinking for a moment, then smiling. Not wide, not proud, just real. He turned to the camera just briefly, as if answering a question that hadn't been asked out loud. I'm going to law school, he said. And one day, no one will be silenced in court like my father was. And with that, he kept walking. Down the courthouse steps, into the street, into whatever came next. The fight wasn't over, but something had changed. He was no longer a boy on trial. He was a voice. And voices like his don't fade, they echo. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like the video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support means the world to us, and it's what keeps us creating meaningful stories like this one. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next powerful voice that deserves to be heard. Thank you for being part of this journey.